Newcastle is supposed to be the great northern city. The Tyne Bridge, the Angel of the North, the Quayside, St James's Park. A city that rebuilt itself from shipbuilding and coal into a regional capital with 2 universities, a national reputation for nightlife, and a football club that defines the identity of an entire region. For the men in this video, Newcastle became something else. A city where a door security boss built a protection empire across Tyneside's pubs and clubs and was shot 3 times on a high street on New Year's Eve, and nobody was ever charged. A city where a West End feud produced 22 people shot and a torture trial in which a man had his teeth removed with pliers. A city where a prisoner ran a 53-kilogram cocaine operation from inside his cell. A city where a gang moved 200 kilograms of amphetamine in vans disguised as AA and British gas vehicles and kept a hand grenade in a family home. Today we are covering Newcastle's most notorious gangsters and the full list of crime bosses that defined the city's darkest chapters. Section 1. The Door Wars, the West End, and the city that made Viv Graham. Wallsend High Street is a commercial strip in the east of North Tyneside, a few miles downstream from Newcastle city centre along the River Tyne. It is a functional high street of the kind that exists in dozens of post-industrial English towns, and it would have remained entirely unremarkable in the national record had it not been for what happened there at approximately 6:10 p.m. on New Year's Eve 1993. A man named Vivian Graham, known universally as Viv, stepped out of a pub on Border Road near Wallsend High Street and never made it to his car. A gunman fired 3 shots at close range. One shot left a large hole in Graham's back. Despite the severity of his wounds, he managed to drag himself along the street until he was found by a fellow doorman named Terry Scott. He was taken to North Tyneside General Hospital, where medics administered 30 pints of blood in an attempt to save his life. 4 hours later, Viv Graham died. He was 34 years old. His murder has never been solved. Graham had been born in 1959 in Rowlands Gill, a village on the outskirts of the Tyneside conurbation. He had been a talented amateur heavyweight boxer in his youth, physically imposing in a way that made him a natural fit for door security work when he transitioned away from the sport. He was described by those who knew him as 17 stone of muscle, who could bench press 520 pounds. He began working doors in Newcastle alongside established Gateshead hardmen Billy Robinson and Paddy Leonard, and rapidly made a reputation for himself that went well beyond ordinary door work. By his early 30s, Graham was not working for anybody else. He was running a security empire that controlled the doors of licensed premises across central Newcastle, the city's East End and Wallsend. The pubs, clubs and bars that employed him did so because having Viv Graham's firm on the door meant nobody caused trouble. Anybody who did was dealt with by Graham himself, personally, and the consequences were swift and memorable. The criminal dimension of that operation was not concealed. Graham was involved in extortion and racketeering. Licensed premises paid his firm not merely for door security, but for the absence of the kind of problems that Graham and his associates could arrange to appear if payment was not made. He had a conviction for assault dating from 1990, when he led an attack on another doorman, Stuart Wilson, at the former Hobos nightclub on Bath Lane in Newcastle city centre, for which he received a 3-year sentence. He had survived several attempts on his life before the night of New Year's Eve 1993. A car had driven past his home and a passenger fired shots through the windows. In the days immediately before Christmas 1993, he had been involved in a confrontation in Newcastle in which he physically overpowered a group attempting to remove his firm from a premises. He was aware that there were people who wanted him gone. He had often told those close to him that he would not see 40. The ecstasy era had changed the economics of the door trade across Britain during the late 1980s, and Newcastle was no exception. When ecstasy arrived in volume on Tyneside, the pubs and clubs that Viv Graham controlled the doors of became commercial targets for the drug gangs who understood that door control meant access control, and access control meant the ability to determine who sold what to whom inside a venue. Graham's position on controlled substances was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a genuine one rather than a convenient posture. He did not deal. He did not allow dealing to operate in the venues he controlled without his permission, and without payment. He had blocked certain gangs from access to premises across the city, which made him a direct obstacle to their commercial ambitions. His former partner Anna Connolly confirmed in the BBC podcast Gangster, the story of Viv Graham, that he would allow certain dealers to operate in return for payments, but that he had actively blocked operations he disapproved of and made serious enemies as a result. The power vacuum created by Graham's death was immediate and significant. On January 6, 1994, 6 days after the shooting, approximately 200 doormen gathered at Macy's Club in Newcastle's Cloth Market to discuss what the murder meant for the door security industry and how to respond to it. The publicans along Wallsend High Street, where Graham had been a regular and where he had interests in at least one establishment, launched a radio pager scheme so that they could warn each other about potential trouble in the absence of the protection his firm had provided. Northumbria police launched a major investigation. Several people were arrested and questioned. No one was ever charged. 30 years later, the case remains open and formally unsolved. What the killing of Viv Graham did was remove the one figure whose personal authority had been sufficient to hold a degree of equilibrium across Newcastle's door trade. Graham had operated, in a very specific sense, as a governing force in the licensed economy of a significant part of the city. His willingness to use violence to enforce that governance was real and documented. His death did not end the violence, it redistributed it. The factions that had been operating in the space around him, constrained by his presence, were now unconstrained. The West End of Newcastle, where a rival crime family had been building their own infrastructure, was about to move into a period of conflict that would produce one of the most notorious trials in the North East's criminal history. The man at the centre of that conflict had grown up in Newcastle's West End, had been feuding with the Harrison family for years before the night that led to the torture trial, and would become Britain's most wanted after escaping from a prison taxi. His name was Paddy Conroy, and the case against him is in the next section. Section 2. Paddy Conroy, the torture trial, and Britain's most wanted man. Scotswood Road runs through the western edge of Newcastle, connecting the city centre to the residential areas of the West End that spread north and south of the main road. The streets that branch off it, through Benwell and Leamington and into Cowgate, form the geographic heartland of the Conroy family's territory. Paddy Conroy had grown up in that landscape. He was from Newcastle's West End in the most literal sense. It was where his family lived, where his loyalties were formed, and where the feud that would define the most documented chapter of his criminal career had its roots. The feud was with the Harrisons, another West End family. It had been running for years before it reached the point that it became the subject of a criminal trial, and it escalated, in the period around the early 1990s, through a sequence of provocations and counter-provocations that eventually produced a level of violence the court records of the era describe with some care. The immediate trigger for the event at the centre of the 1995 trial was an act of desecration. Members of the Harrison family, in the course of their ongoing conflict with the Conroys, desecrated the grave of Paddy Conroy's father. The headstone was vandalised. There were reports of an attempt to dig up the buried remains. For Conroy, a man for whom family loyalty was the defining principle of his own self-description, the attack on his father's grave was not something that could be answered with a proportionate response. What followed was not proportionate. It was deliberate, methodical, and very specifically calibrated to communicate what crossing that line would cost. A man named Billy Collier, described as a friend of the Harrison family and understood by Conroy's operation to be connected to the provocations against the Conroys, was seized. He was handcuffed and restrained. The court at the subsequent trial heard what took place during the period he was held. A pair of pliers was used to pull out the sides of his nostrils. His front teeth were extracted with the same instrument. David Glover was convicted alongside Conroy for his role in the events. The prosecution's case was that this was not impulsive violence, but a deliberate act of torture carried out to send a message of the kind that only an act of extreme specific harm could deliver. The message was about the grave. The method was chosen to ensure it would not be forgotten. The context in which that event sat was extensive. The feud between the Conroys and the Harrisons and the wider West End gang conflicts of that period had produced a catalogue of serious incidents. The book, written by former villain Bernard O'Mahony about Conroy's story, titled In the Name of My Father, described the feud as Britain's bloodiest gang war. The specific statistics the book and the reporting around the period reference include 22 combatants shot across the streets of Newcastle's West End over the duration of the conflict. One man was stabbed with a samurai sword. Several homes were petrol-bombed. A 200-doorman meeting had taken place in the cloth market 6 days after Viv Graham's killing, at which the implications of the power vacuum were discussed openly. Into that vacuum, the competing families of the West End were fighting with a ferocity that made the post-Graham era one of the most violent periods in Tyneside's modern criminal history. Conroy was convicted of kidnap, torture, and false imprisonment in 1995 and received a 14-year sentence. He was held in Category A conditions, which placed him in the nation's highest security prison estate. What happened next became, for a period, one of the most discussed events in British criminal justice. Conroy escaped from a prison taxi during a transfer. He went on the run. The subsequent manhunt, which extended across Europe and eventually to Spain, led to him being described publicly as Britain's most wanted man. The designation was accurate in a formal sense. He was the subject of an active international warrant. He had demonstrated both the means and the will to evade custody, and he had connections across the criminal networks of multiple countries that made his recapture a genuinely complex investigative challenge. He was eventually located and returned to custody in Spain. He served the bulk of his sentence, was released on licence in the mid-2000s, and a McIntyre's Underworld documentary found him at home on licence within weeks of release, with a reported £100,000 contract on his head, placed by rival figures who had not forgiven the events of the Conroy years. The Conroy case sits at the intersection of the personal and the structural in a way that makes it distinctive within the wider Newcastle organised crime record. It was not primarily a drugs case or a financial fraud. It was a territorial and familial conflict conducted at a level of physical violence that the court record makes plain. The torture trial, as it became known in the local press and in the books written about it, revealed a West End underworld in which the rules of engagement were set by the capacity for violence rather than by any external constraint. Paddy Conroy, whatever else is said of him, was a man who operated by those rules with complete consistency. The Sayers family, who had been building their own reputation across Tyneside throughout the same period, would come to be described by Northumbria police as requiring a dedicated unit to address. That unit, the assessment of the family as a new breed of criminal, and the Old Bailey conviction of John Henry Sayers in 2018 are in the next section. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Sayers family had their own dedicated police unit, 3 generations of documented criminal activity, and an Old Bailey acquittal for conspiracy to murder, before John Henry Sayers was eventually convicted of perverting the course of justice. That case is next. Section 3. The Sayers family, La Geordie Cosa Nostra and the Untouchables unit. Fossway is a road in Walker, in the east end of Newcastle, running through a residential area between the city centre and the North Tyneside boundary. John Henry Sayers, 54 at the time of his 2018 sentencing, was formally recorded as residing there. Walker is not Benwell. It is not the West End. The Sayers family operated across the geography of the city without being tied to one particular postcode, in the way that the Conroy family had been rooted in the West End. That flexibility was part of what made them, in the assessment of Northumbria police, a different kind of criminal organisation from those that had preceded them. The force's own statement about the Sayers family described the officers tasked with addressing them as dealing with a new breed of criminal. A dedicated unit was set up specifically to investigate and build cases against the family. The unit was referred to informally as the Untouchables, a name that captured both the ambition of the policing strategy and the frustration of 2 decades spent watching acquittals accumulate. The Sayers name in Newcastle criminal history begins with John Bryan Sayers, the patriarch, who was sentenced to between 3 months and 18 months in the aftermath of the Battle of Percy Street in 1963, a documented gang confrontation in Newcastle city centre that became an early reference point in the family's long history with the courts. John Bryan Sayers went on, following his release, to build what the available reporting describes as the head of the notorious Sayers crime firm. Over the decades that followed, his sons and their associates were linked in press reporting, police intelligence, and eventual court proceedings to armed robbery, extortion, money laundering, and the supply of controlled substances across Tyneside. The book La Geordie Cosa Nostra, which took its title from the comparison Northumbria police officers had drawn between the Sayers operation and the structure of Italian organised crime, attempted to document the scope of what the family had built. A second book, written by Stephen Sayers himself, entitled The Sayers, Tried and Tested at the Highest Level, gave the family's own account of their reputation. John Henry Sayers, known as the most publicly prominent of the family's modern generation, acquired a legal record of acquittals that became, in its own way, as much a part of his reputation as any conviction. He was cleared of ordering the doorstep shooting of a man in 2000. He was subsequently cleared of nobbling the Leeds jury in that case. Both acquittals sat in the background of the Tup Tup Palace prosecution that brought him before the Old Bailey in 2018. The Tup Tup Palace was a Newcastle nightclub. On June 6, 2015, a doorman named Matthew Macaulay was shot outside the club when a gunman on a motorbike opened fire using a sawn-off shotgun. Macaulay was struck in the arm. 2 other members of staff were also injured. The prosecution's case, led by prosecutor Simon Dennison QC, was that Sayers had ordered the attack because his son had been turned away from the club weeks earlier, and that John Henry Sayers was a man who would not allow his name to be disrespected. The jury deliberated for more than 30 hours. They found Sayers not guilty of conspiracy to murder, alongside co-defendant Michael Dixon. Both men gave audible sighs of relief in the dock as the verdict was delivered. Dixon was convicted of a separate charge of conspiracy to possess a shotgun with intent to endanger life, relating to a different incident, and received a life sentence with a minimum of 8 years. Sayers and a third defendant, Michael McDougall, were convicted of perverting the course of justice. McDougall, serving a life sentence for a separate murder, had attempted to claim in a false statement that he was the gunman in the Tup Tup Palace shooting. The jury found the statement was a pack of lies, constructed to provide cover for others. McDougall received 2 years consecutive, on top of his existing life sentence. John Henry Sayers, 54, of Fossway Walker, was sentenced to 3.5 years for perverting the course of justice at the Old Bailey on 21 September 2018. The prosecutor's description of him to the jury as a man to be feared who had acquired and promoted a reputation and would not allow his name to be disrespected was the most precise public summary of what the Sayers name represented in Newcastle's criminal landscape that any court proceeding had yet produced. Stephen Sayers, John Henry's brother, published his memoir in 2015. Fred Foreman, a name from London's criminal history, contributed an endorsement. Northumbria Police's characterisation of the family remained consistent across the decades, a new breed of criminal operating at a level that required a dedicated investigative unit, linked in intelligence and in the public record to virtually every category of serious organised crime on Tyneside. The next case moves away from the family feuds and into the digital era. Michael Ferry was serving a sentence at HMP Northumberland in 2020 when he obtained an EncroChat handset inside the prison and used it to direct a 53-kilogram cocaine operation from his cell. That case is next. Section 4. Michael Ferry, the HMP Northumberland plot, and 22 years. HMP Northumberland is a Category C training prison operated by Sodexo Justice Services on behalf of His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. It sits near Morpeth, roughly 15 miles north of Newcastle city centre. In March 2020, Michael Ferry, aged 33, was serving a 45-month sentence there for his part in a violent disorder committed in December 2016, a gang attack on the Foss pub in Walker, Newcastle, in which a man was beaten and sprayed with ammonia. He was, on paper, incapacitated. He was inside a prison. He had a sentence running. What he also had, between March and May 2020, was an EncroChat-enabled device that he had obtained inside the prison and was using to coordinate the supply of 53 kilograms of cocaine and at least 17 kilograms of cannabis into the northeast from his cell. The EncroChat platform had been adopted by serious organised crime groups across Europe precisely because its security architecture was believed to be impenetrable to law enforcement. The platform operated through specialist encrypted handsets and a dedicated communications infrastructure. Users paid for subscription access. The fact that Ferry had obtained one of these devices while serving a prison sentence said something about both his standing within the organised crime group he was connected to and the limitations of the physical barrier that imprisonment was supposed to represent. The encrypted messages recovered after the platform was compromised by French and Dutch police in 2020 captured the full picture of what Ferry had been operating. The messages showed Ferry communicating with associates on the outside about the movement of cocaine and cannabis into the northeast. They showed him directing operations, arranging deliveries, managing the logistics of a multi-kilogram supply chain, and issuing instructions about matters beyond the supply of controlled substances. Investigators established from the message record that Ferry had commissioned 2 separate acts of criminal damage, one at an address in Killingworth and one at a tattoo parlour where a vehicle was driven into the front of the premises. The capacity for violence and intimidation that the prosecution described as a feature of the organised crime group Ferry was part of was not theoretical, it was operational, directed from a prison cell through an encrypted handset. The messages also captured what Ferry's associates thought of his position. One told him directly, "You are destined for the top." Another message stated, "You are at the top in the northeast and you are only in second gear." A cannabis cultivation operation connected to the conspiracy was identified during the investigation, containing 1,100 plants at a site capable of producing tens of kilograms of the drug. Ferry and an associate had also discussed, in the recovered communications, a target of making £1 million each within 3 years from the operation. He was a man with a sentence for violent disorder running, describing himself and being described by associates as the dominant figure in a drug supply network, making plans for post-release control of that network from inside a cell. Ferry was further arrested in November 2020 after the EncroChat evidence had been processed. He pleaded guilty 8 days into his trial at Newcastle Crown Court to conspiracy to supply cocaine and conspiracy to supply cannabis. Detective Chief Inspector Mark Michael of Northumbria Police described him, after sentencing, as a prominent and well-connected figure who held significant standing within an organised crime group and noted that Ferry had believed himself above the law through his use of the encrypted device. The judge, Stephen Earle, told the court that the organised crime group Ferry was part of was not only dealing in vast quantities of controlled substances, but had recourse to intimidation, threats and violence as and when required. Michael Ferry, 33, previously of Wimslow Close, Wallsend, was sentenced to 22 years and 6 months at Newcastle Crown Court. He must serve at least 11 years before being eligible for consideration of release. The 45-month sentence he had been serving for the Walker pub attack continued alongside the new term. The specific detail of a man directing a multi-kilo cocaine operation, commissioning criminal damage against specific premises, and planning his post-release takeover of the supply chain, all from a cell in HMP Northumberland using an encrypted handset, sits at the operationally remarkable end of what the EncroChat prosecutions across England produced. Ferry was not a peripheral figure who had obtained a phone opportunistically. He was described by his own associates as the dominant force in northeast drug supply. He was operating from prison as though the building around him was a minor inconvenience rather than a custodial sentence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case covers the Benwell network dismantled in 2017, where 6,500 people visited addresses in Benwell to buy cocaine across a 5-month period, and officers recovered cocaine wrapped in cupcake casings, alongside 90 knives, 6 axes, crossbows, and knuckle dusters. That operation is next. Section 5. The Benwell Network, the cupcake cocaine, and 6,500 customers. Benwell Lane is a road in the Benwell area of Newcastle's West End, running through residential streets that sit a short distance from the Scotswood Road corridor that had been the territory of the Conroy family in the previous decade. Benwell itself is a district with a long association with the western edge of Newcastle's organised crime geography. The Sayers and Conroy cases had played out in adjacent territory. The network dismantled in 2017 in Benwell was operating in the same postcode area through different individuals and a different generation, but with the same structural logic. A concentrated territorial operation supplying a customer base that police surveillance eventually quantified with a specificity that the court record preserved. Over 5 months of observation by officers from the Newcastle West Neighbourhood Policing Team, 6,500 people were watched visiting addresses in Benwell to purchase cocaine. The number is not approximate. It is the figure that investigators logged across the full surveillance period before they moved to make arrests. The investigation that preceded the February 2017 raids involved months of plainclothes observation of the gang's distribution addresses. Officers documented the volume of foot traffic, the patterns of movement, and the structure of the operation as it operated day to day. The gang was not attempting to conceal itself from the local community. The antisocial behaviour connected to the dealing, the Chronicle Live reporting from the time noted, had made the neighbours' lives a living hell. The community impact of a high-volume street-level supply operation is rarely confined to the buyers. The addresses used as distribution points become reference points for all the associated activity that surrounds a busy drug supply operation. Northumbria Police worked alongside Newcastle City Council to evict a number of residents connected to the criminal activity from their properties as part of the response to the investigation. The late-night raids in February 2017 produced 2 categories of evidence that the subsequent court proceedings relied on. The first was the controlled substances themselves, including a specific detail that became the most referenced element of the case in the regional press coverage: cocaine wrapped inside cupcake casings. The quantity of cocaine found was not the primary measure of the operation's scale. The 5 months of surveillance and the 6,500 documented customer visits established that scale. The cupcake casings were a storage and concealment method, practical rather than theatrical, but striking enough as an image that it anchored the public reporting of the case. The second category of evidence was the weapons cache recovered from one of the properties. 6 air weapons, 90 knives, half a dozen axes, knuckle dusters, crossbows. The sheer volume of edged weapons recovered from a single domestic address was the detail that Chief Inspector Barry Joycey, who led the investigation, highlighted specifically in his statement after sentencing, noting that the scale of the cache demonstrated how dangerous these individuals were and what threat they posed to the wider community. 10 people were arrested across the raids. 5 were subsequently charged with conspiracy to supply Class A substances and admitted the offences at Newcastle Crown Court. The sentencing produced the following outcomes. Michael Conroy, 38, of Sungold Villas, Benwell, received 5 years and 6 months. Paul Basie, 50, of Armstrong Road, Benwell, received 4 years. Walter Henderson, 53, of Meldon Terrace, Heaton, received 3 years. Carl Greenwell, 37, of Benwell Lane, Benwell, received 2 years. Barry Newton, 26, of Newton Street, Holtwhistle, received 2 years. The combined custodial total across the 5 was just over 16 years. The Benwell case sits at a specific point in the Newcastle organised crime timeline, after the Sayers and Conroy era, but before the Encrochat prosecutions transformed the scale of what Northumbria Police were dealing with. It is a street-level operation in the literal sense, run out of domestic addresses in a residential area, staffed by local figures with no apparent international dimension, and sustained by a customer base of 6,500 people visiting in person across 5 months. The arithmetic of that customer volume, translated into transactions and cash, illustrates the commercial reality of what a well-run local supply network generates, even without the multi-kilo importation chains and encrypted communication architecture that the later generation of Newcastle cases would involve. The gang did not need gas canisters from the Netherlands or vans disguised as British gas vehicles. They needed addresses in Benwell, a steady supply chain, and the weapons cache to enforce whatever compliance their operation required. The 6,500 customers came regardless. Shaun Monahan was operating at an entirely different level. 200 kilograms of amphetamine, 51 kilograms of cocaine, a hand grenade stored in a Newcastle home, and vans bearing AA and British Gas logos, moving product across the country during the first COVID lockdown. That case is next. Section 6. Shaun Monahan, the Lockdown Empire and a Hand Grenade in Newcastle. The first national COVID lockdown began on March 23, 2020. By that date, Shaun Monahan's operation was already running at full capacity. The lockdown did not slow it. The prosecutor who opened the case at Newcastle Crown Court, Richard Herman, described the gang as having fed off the misery caused by the pandemic period, operating throughout the shutdown with a volume and consistency that the EncroChat message record, recovered after French police compromised the platform in June 2020, documented in considerable detail. Between March and June 2020, the operation Monahan headed distributed a minimum of 51 kilograms of cocaine, 19 kilograms of heroin, and 200 kilograms of amphetamine across the northeast and beyond. The drugs moved through a supply chain that reached from Leeds to London to Stoke, as well as across Tyneside. The cash moving in the opposite direction was substantial enough that approximately £1.3 million was sent to a single supplier during the month of April 2020 alone. Monahan, 45, of no fixed abode but associated with Newcastle, had a criminal history that the court heard in detail. He had been jailed for 6 years in 2000 for conspiracy to rob. He had been jailed for 8 years in 2013 for conspiracy to supply cocaine. As a result of the 2013 sentence, a serious crime prevention order had been imposed on him. The SCPO placed legal restrictions on his activities upon release. The EncroChat message record showed that he had chosen to ignore those restrictions entirely and to re-enter the supply of controlled substances at a level considerably above anything his previous convictions had reflected. His EncroChat handle was Master Parser. The name carried a certain confidence about it. The messages recovered under that handle documented him orchestrating the wholesale distribution of cocaine, heroin, and amphetamine, coordinating a team of couriers and storemen, and communicating with suppliers and distributors across multiple cities. He offered his associate Simon Lancaster, who handled the London end of the operation, a nice apartment and big wages to set up a permanent branch in the capital. The logistical sophistication of the Monahan operation was a specific feature of the prosecution's case. The vehicles used to move controlled substances and cash were not ordinary cars. Some had purpose-built hidden compartments, known in the trade as hides, allowing significant quantities of material to be transported without detection during routine stops. Others were more conspicuous in their camouflage. The gang used vans with the logos of the AA, British Gas, and courier companies sprayed on the sides. During the first lockdown, when police checkpoints were operating across the country to enforce movement restrictions, vehicles presenting as utility and emergency service vans were significantly less likely to attract scrutiny than unmarked vehicles. The prosecutor described the strategy directly. The gang masqueraded as essential workers in case they were stopped. The vans with company livery were a deliberate and operationally effective deception. The firearms dimension of the case was revealed during a series of search warrants executed at several addresses in Newcastle in April 2020, while the EncroChat investigation was still in its early stages. At those addresses, officers recovered 2 semi-automatic handguns, 2 semi-automatic rifles, a hand grenade, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, alongside 2.5 kilograms of cocaine. The evidence established that these weapons were being stored on behalf of Monahan and were available for use in criminal enterprises as required. The judge at sentencing, Her Honour Judge Julie Clemetson, described the gang's arsenal as weapons they were willing to use to protect their business or supply to other organised crime groups. Stephen Graham, 45, of Alston Gardens, Throckley, Monahan's brother-in-law, had been asked in EncroChat messages to make arrangements for a firearm to be buried. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess firearms on the basis that he was acting as a go-between. When EncroChat was compromised by law enforcement in June 2020, both Monahan and Lancaster received notifications through the platform warning them the network had been busted. Both men left the country. Monahan went first to Dubai, where he was jailed for a separate matter, and then to Turkey. An Interpol red notice was issued. Turkish Interior Minister Ali Yerlikaya announced Monahan's arrest publicly in November 2023, confirming that Turkish police had found Monahan living in the Fatih district of Istanbul and captured him in a hotel room. Video footage released by the Turkish Interior Ministry showed narcotics officers making the arrest. Lancaster, who had also ended up in Dubai and then in Oman, was deported from Oman back to the United Kingdom. He had previous convictions including kidnapping. He pleaded guilty on the basis that he was acting under the instruction of others. The sentencing at Newcastle Crown Court produced the following outcomes. Shaun Monahan, 45, of no fixed abode, received 27 years. Simon Lancaster, 34, of no fixed address, sentenced separately on 9th December 2025 by Her Honour Judge Julie Clemetson, received 14 years and 8 months. James Ramshaw, 41, of Hambleton Court, Ashington, received 9 years and 4 months. Stephen Graham, 45, of Alston Gardens, Throckley, received 8 years. Bryn Bowden, 28, of West Farm Avenue, Long Benton, whose EncroChat handle was Known Hippo, received 7 years. James White, 45, of Orchard Drive, Newbiggin Hall, Newcastle, who had stored drugs for the operation to clear a personal debt, received 6 years. David Nixon, Monahan's trusted lieutenant, had been sentenced separately in 2021 to 15 years for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and possessing prohibited firearms and ammunition. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kevin Taylor of Newcastle was running a parallel EncroChat operation that the NCA assessed as involving more than 200 kilograms of cocaine, with a street value of £68.75 million. The cocaine was shipped from the Netherlands inside gas canisters. Taylor's EncroChat handle was Loyal Mover. His sentence was 27 years. That case and the full co-defendant list are in the next section. Section 7. Kevin Taylor, Loyal Mover, and 200 kilograms in gas canisters. Heatherslaw Road is a residential street in the north of Newcastle. It was the registered address of Colin Somerville, 46, the man who served as Kevin Taylor's second-in-command in what the NCA described as one of the most significant cocaine importation networks to be dismantled through Operation Venetic in the northeast of England. The operation's mechanics were specific and worth setting out precisely because the method used to move 172 kilograms of cocaine from the south of England to Tyneside was not a standard courier arrangement. Empty gas canisters were obtained. They were cut open. Cocaine was packed inside. The canisters were then welded shut again and repainted to look like ordinary unused gas containers. Between October 2019 and April 2020, 12 of these canisters were collected by vehicles from collection points in Chatham in Kent, Corby and Northampton and Peterborough. Each canister contained between 12 and 16 kilograms of cocaine, producing a total of 172 kilograms. The canisters were then driven the length of the country north to Tyneside, where Somerville received them and opened them to extract the product for onward distribution. The man who orchestrated the full operation from the top was Kevin Taylor, 43, from Newcastle upon Tyne. His EncroChat handle was Loyal Mover. The handle was a statement of identity rather than a precaution. Taylor's operation was not simply the gas canister importation. That 172-kilogram pipeline was one element of a wider conspiracy that the NCA assessed as involving more than 200 kilograms of cocaine in total, with an estimated street value of £68.75 million. Part of the wider 200-kilogram importation included 42 kilograms that Taylor planned to smuggle from the Netherlands between March and June 2020, arranged with the assistance of David Jeavons, 60, of Bockenfield Country Park, Felton, Northumberland, whose EncroChat handle was Slick Pearl. Jeavons had the role of organiser and facilitator, making plans for the substances to be imported and moved to the northeast. When officers arrested him, £24,000 in cash was found in the roof of his caravan. The supporting network Taylor had built around himself was extensive and operationally layered. Michael Watson, 46, and Craig Martin, 47, both from Newcastle, were responsible for collecting the gas canisters from their delivery points and moving the extracted cocaine to the next stage of the distribution chain. They also moved £8.2 million in cash in the opposite direction, paying for further supplies. Craig Martin, whose EncroChat handle was Military Spider, was paid £26,000 for his courier role and was responsible for the collection and delivery of approximately 100 kilograms of the total amount, making him one of the most active logistics figures in the chain. At one point, £500,000 in cash was found hidden behind a fireplace in a Newcastle home where Martin had deposited it. Stephen Fates, 38, of Lansdowne Terrace West, North Shields, was one of the most significant figures below Taylor in the network's structure. His EncroChat handle was Crowd Control. He bought more than 100 kilograms of cocaine directly from Taylor for onward distribution. He owned a Citroën Citan van fitted with a purpose-built hide that he used to conceal encrypted phones. He orchestrated drug handovers, drop-offs, pickups, and sample taking, providing times, locations, and tokens to ensure each exchange ran cleanly. Craig Dalton, 49, of Norham Road, North Shields, used his legitimate employment as a taxi driver to courier cash on Fates' behalf, with numerous exchange locations documented in his seized phone. Philip Curry, 48, of Buddle Terrace, West Allotment, Newcastle, operated a compound where cocaine was tested, washed, and repressed to increase its purity and maximise the profit generated from each kilogram before it entered street distribution. The wider conspiracy extended to Liverpool. Shaun Ennis, 55, from Sefton, was a Liverpool-based courier who had arranged to supply 2 kilograms of cocaine hidden inside a spare wheel to be collected at his home address by Gerard Gannon, 58. In April 2020, Gannon was stopped by police on the A1 northbound near Tadcaster. In the spare wheel of his Mercedes van, officers found £73,500 in cash. The A1 stop was one of several physical interceptions that gave investigators early threads to pull before the full EncroChat archive became available. Goldie, a lorry driver connected to the network, was also arrested on the A1 northbound between junctions 60 and 61 in mid-April 2020 after £15,020 was found in the lorry he was driving. When 10 kilograms of the cocaine went missing at one point during the operation, the EncroChat message record showed Taylor and his associates discussing the situation and identifying a man in Fenham, Newcastle, who they believed had taken it. Messages about grabbing him were intercepted. Northumbria police issued an Osman warning to the man, formally informing him that his life was in danger. The sentencing across the Taylor network, conducted in multiple hearings at Newcastle Crown Court through 2025, produced the following confirmed outcomes. Kevin Taylor, 43, from Newcastle, 27 years. Stephen Fates, 38, of Lansdowne Terrace West, North Shields, 26 years, sentenced 24th February 2025. Colin Somerville, 46, of Heatherslaw Road, Newcastle, 20 years, sentenced 24th February 2025. Craig Martin, 47, of Dorcas Avenue, Newcastle, 9 years and 7 months. David Jevons, 60, of Bockenfield Country Park, Felton, 10 years and 8 months, sentenced 26 September 2025. Philip Curry, 48, of Buddle Terrace, West Allotment, Newcastle, 14 years, sentenced 24th February 2025. Craig Dalton, 49, of Norham Road, North Shields, 5 years and 3 months, sentenced 24th February 2025. David Bowen, 53, of Flemingmead, Mitcham, London, 4 years, sentenced 26th September 2025, in addition to a previous 10 years and 8 months received in December 2023 for separate EncroChat offending. William McChesney, 35, of Brookfield Avenue, Banbridge, County Down, Northern Ireland, 7 years, sentenced December 2024. The combined total across confirmed sentences in the Taylor network exceeded 141 years. Robert Taylor of Exeter Road, Wallsend, was sentenced in his absence to 7.5 years in February 2024 and was found months later in a townhouse in Medellin, Colombia, with armed officers climbing a ladder to enter through the balcony. That case is next. Section 8. The Colombia Fugitives, the Wallsend Man, and the extradition that took years. Exeter Road is in the Wallsend area of Newcastle, close to the High Street where Viv Graham was shot 3 times and dragged himself along the pavement on New Year's Eve 1993. The name of the street is coincidental to that proximity, but the geography is not. Wallsend has appeared at intervals throughout the history of Newcastle's organised crime record, as both an address and a setting. Robert Taylor, 54, was formally registered at an address on Exeter Road in Wallsend when he became the subject of a Northumbria police investigation arising from Operation Venetic. The charges against him were drug supply and money laundering. His trial was listed at Newcastle Crown Court. He did not attend. In February 2024, Taylor was sentenced in his absence to 7.5 years in prison. By that point, he had been gone for some time. The investigation to find him had already begun. The pattern of northeast encrochat figures fleeing to warm weather jurisdictions rather than facing trial had been established by the Monahan case. Monahan had gone to Dubai and then to Turkey. Simon Lancaster had gone to Dubai and then to Oman. Kevin Taylor, the loyal mover, was arrested and tried in his presence. Robert Taylor took a different route. The NCA, working alongside Northumbria Police, tracked him to South America. He had made it as far as Colombia, specifically to a property in the city of Medellin, Colombia's second largest city, and a place with its own very particular history in the global organised crime record. In Medellin, Robert Taylor was found sharing a property with a second British fugitive, Michael O'Brien, 41, of Layfield Road, West Derby, Liverpool. O'Brien was wanted on a separate and substantially more serious charge sheet: conspiracy to supply cocaine, heroin, MDMA, and cannabis, conspiracy to possess firearms with intent to endanger life, conspiracy to transfer a prohibited weapon, money laundering, and perverting the course of justice. The arrest was made by officers from the Policía Nacional de Colombia following a joint investigation involving the NCA and Northumbria Police. The Director of Colombia's National Police, Brigadier General William Oswaldo Rincon Zambrano, published a video on social media documenting the moment of entry. Armed officers were filmed climbing a ladder to access the property via a balcony. The footage showed the 2 men being detained inside the building. Photographs released subsequently showed one of the men holding a Pomeranian puppy on a sofa, surrounded by Colombian police officers. The faces of both men were digitally blurred in the images released to the public. Both were taken into custody to await extradition proceedings. The NCA's Deputy Director of International Operations, Rick Jones, described the Colombian police as having shown unwavering determination in locating and detaining the 2 men. The Colombia arrests were part of a broader pattern of Operation Venetic fugitives being returned to the United Kingdom through international cooperation that had no fixed timeline or geographic limit. Andrew Doran, 42, originally from the Kirby area of Merseyside, and a key player in the gas canister cocaine importation connected to the Taylor network, had been arrested by Spanish police in southern Spain following an NCA appeal. He was extradited to the United Kingdom on 1st of October 2025 by Specialist National Extradition Unit officers from the NCA's Joint International Crime Centre. Doran appeared at Newcastle Crown Court on December 12, 2025 and admitted his role in the conspiracy, using the EncroChat handle Jurgen619 to direct the movement of cocaine from the Netherlands into the gas canister supply chain. He was remanded into custody ahead of a sentencing hearing scheduled for 27 February 2026. The cumulative picture of what Operation Venetic produced in the northeast is worth taking a moment to register. From a single encrypted communications platform, compromised by French and Dutch law enforcement in the spring and summer of 2020, investigators in Newcastle, London, and multiple international jurisdictions built cases that reached from a prison cell in HMP Northumberland, where Michael Ferry was directing a 53-kilogram cocaine supply chain from his bunk, to a townhouse balcony in Medellin, where Robert Taylor was detained by Colombian officers climbing a ladder in the early hours. The sentences produced across the network of cases connected to Operation Venetic in the Northumbria police area alone exceeded several hundred years of combined custodial time. What the fugitive pattern reveals, across Monahan in Istanbul, Lancaster in Oman, and Taylor in Medellin, is not a sophisticated escape strategy. It is a series of temporary relocations by men who understood that their communications had been compromised and who did not believe that extradition would reach them in whichever jurisdiction they had selected. Turkey, Oman, Colombia. Each represented a calculation about geographic distance and legal complexity. None of the calculations proved correct. The Interpol Red Notice found Monahan in a hotel room in the Fatih district of Istanbul. The deportation process returned Lancaster from Oman. The ladder over the balcony in Medellin brought Taylor and O'Brien back into custody. The NCA's position on each case was consistent and stated plainly after each arrest, there is nowhere to hide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final two sections cover the Gateshead Operation Salvatore network, the Bladen and Winlayton supply chain that produced 45 years combined, and the closing account of what 4 decades of Newcastle's organised crime record shows, from Viv Graham's unsolved shooting to the Colombia Fugitives. Those sections are next. Section 9. The Gateshead Network, Operation Salvatore, and 45 years combined Wardle Gardens, is a residential street in Felling, a district in the borough of Gateshead that sits on the south bank of the Tyne, roughly 2 miles east of Gateshead town centre. Nathan Graham, 30, lived there. He was, in the assessment of Northumbria Police and the subsequent findings at Newcastle Crown Court, the ringleader of an organised crime group that had been flooding the streets of Gateshead and the wider northeast with cocaine and heroin over an extended period. The investigation that eventually brought Graham to justice had a specific trigger. Between 2017 and 2018, the number of drug-related deaths in Gateshead rose in a way that concerned Northumbria Police enough to commit to a significant covert operation. Plainclothed officers spent hundreds of hours carrying out surveillance of individuals they believed were supplying controlled substances to vulnerable users. The investigation also involved undercover purchases, with officers posing as users and making controlled buys from multiple dealers operating across the borough. The operation that consumed those hundreds of surveillance hours was codenamed Operation Salvatore. Its day of action came in April 2019, when more than 60 suspects were arrested in a single coordinated sweep. Officers raided 37 addresses within 24 hours. Drugs, cash, and weapons were recovered across the raids. The scale of that single day gave an indication of how broadly the supply network had spread across Gateshead in the years it had been operating. It was not a single street or a single estate. It was a distribution network covering the borough, serviced by a hierarchy of dealers, drivers, and a central figure at Wardle Gardens, who had been directing operations with enough consistency to generate the kind of supply that was contributing to the drug death statistics that had started the investigation in the first place. 6 members of the network admitted conspiracy to supply Class A substances early in the proceedings and were sentenced to a combined total of almost 20 years at Newcastle Crown Court before the final wave of sentencings. The 3 principal figures were dealt with in the subsequent hearing. Nathan Graham of Wardle Gardens Felling pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy to supply Class A substances and 2 counts of acquiring criminal property. He was jailed for 10 years and 8 months. Dean Joycey, 32, of Devon Crescent, Birtley, admitted 2 counts of conspiracy to supply Class A substances and was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months. Jonathan Ash, 21, also of Devon Crescent, Birtley, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy to supply Class A substances and received a 2-year sentence suspended for 2 years. Superintendent Brad Howe of Northumbria Police noted after the sentencing that the combined total across all proceedings had reached more than 30 years. The Felling and Gateshead network, dismantled by Operation Salvatore, was operating in the same broad landscape as a second Gateshead area operation that had been under investigation simultaneously and which the court record from the same period documents in comparable detail. Oliver Howlett, 31, of Easdale Gardens, Low Fell, led an organised crime group that the evidence at Newcastle Crown Court established was generating £2,600 a day from the supply of cocaine and heroin across Gateshead using 3 phone lines some of which were contacting over 100 numbers each day. The operation was so commercial in its approach that Howlett's phones were used at certain points to advertise what the court record described as special offers on the controlled substances being sold. A police officer posing as a user had been deployed onto the streets of Felling in 2018 as the investigation into the rise in drug deaths in the area intensified, and the undercover operation revealed the scale of what Howlett was running. Howlett was jailed for 11 years and 7 months. His girlfriend Paige Bullock, 23, of Oakwood, Leam Lane, received 8 years and 1 month. Her father, Paul Bullock, 46, of Broomlaw, Gateshead, received 8 years and 1 month. Howlett's lieutenant, Gordon Hunter, 37, of Bondine Avenue West, Gateshead, received 9 years. Stephen Douglas, 33, of Mulberry Gardens, Felling, received 7 years and 2 months. Brian Sewell, 26, of Howe Street, Gateshead, received 6 years and 5 months. Paul McKenna, 36, of Elizabeth Avenue, Bertley, received 4 years and 9 months. The Ross and Moulding network from the Blaydon and Winlayton area of Gateshead ran in parallel with both of those operations and addressed a different part of the regional supply chain. Tony David Ross, 34, of Valley Crescent, Blaydon, was the principal figure, running the operation alongside his father, Anthony Thompson Ross, 55, of Hanover Drive, Winlayton, and Brian Stewart Moulding, 38, of June Avenue, Winlayton Mill. The investigation involved 6 months of surveillance, with the operation identified as running out of addresses in Blaydon, Winlayton, North Shields, and Burradon. A professional cannabis farm was discovered at the Camperdown Industrial Estate in Burradon as part of the investigation, establishing that the group was not simply distributing purchased product, but was also producing Class B substances at commercial scale. The initial raids in October 2016 arrested 9 people and seized more than 1 kilogram of cocaine. The trial concluded in July 2018 and sentencing followed in November of that year at Newcastle Crown Court, producing the following outcomes across 11 defendants. Tony David Ross, 34, of Valley Crescent, Blaydon, 10 years and 9 months. Brian Stewart Moulding, 38, of June Avenue, Winlayton Mill, 8 years. Anthony Thompson Ross, 55, of Hanover Drive, Winlayton, 5 years. James Medine, 43, of Milton Grove, Prudo, 8 years. Scott David Mackenzie, 29, of Briar Close, Winlayton, 3 years. Liam Teruel, 25, of Union Quay, North Shields, 3 years. Robert Paul Stewart, 37, of Hesketh Way, Liverpool, 3 years. David Bradley, 34, of Greenvale Avenue, Newcastle, 2 years and 6 months. Anthony Jessup, 28, of Ullswater Way, Newcastle, 2 years and 4 months. Stephen Atkin, 33, of Briar Close, Winlayton, 18 months suspended. Jason Snowball, 22, of Tynebank, Winlayton, 2 years suspended. The combined custodial total across the 11 exceeded 45 years. What the 3 Gateshead area networks document, taken together, is the depth of the organised supply infrastructure that existed across the south bank of the Tyne during the years between the pre-digital era of Viv Graham and Paddy Conroy and the EncroChat epoch of Monahan and Taylor. These were not the same level of operation. None of the Gateshead cases involved the gas canister importation logistics, the multi-hundred kilogram volumes, or the international fugitive trails of the operations that would come to dominate the Newcastle organised crime record from 2020 onward. But they were running simultaneously, supplying the same streets, producing the same drug deaths in Felling and Gateshead that triggered Operation Salvatore in the first place. The EncroChat era did not replace the street-level supply networks, it sat above them. The final section covers what the full 4-decade sweep of Newcastle's organised crime record actually shows, from Viv Graham's unsolved shooting on Wallsend High Street to the Columbia Townhouse, and what the cases in this video tell you when you read them as one continuous story, rather than separate incidents. Section 10. David Nixon, the Trusted Lieutenant, and what 4 decades of Newcastle crime shows. Wimslow Close is a residential address in Wallsend, the same part of North Tyneside where Viv Graham was shot 3 times on New Year's Eve 1993, and where Robert Taylor of Exeter Road was sentenced in absentia to 7.5 years in February 2024, before being found in a townhouse in Medellin. The name Wallsend appears at intervals throughout the Newcastle organised crime record in a way that is not quite coincidence and not quite pattern. It is simply geography, a part of Tyneside that has produced, over 30 years, a disproportionate number of the names that appear in the court record of serious organised crime in the northeast. Michael Ferry, previously of Wimslow Close, Wallsend, was running a 53-kilogram cocaine operation from a cell in HMP Northumberland when Northumbria Police began building the case that would eventually produce a 22-year and 6-month sentence. He is one data point in a record that stretches back to a Ford Sierra Cosworth parked in a side street off Wallsend High Street in December 1993, and a gunman lurking in the shadows. David Nixon was Shaun Monahan's trusted lieutenant. The description came from the Crown Prosecution Service in the statement issued after Nixon's sentencing in 2021. Nixon was not charged alongside Monahan, Bowden, White, Ramshaw, Graham and Lancaster in the main October 2025 sentencing at Newcastle Crown Court. He had been dealt with separately, earlier, in a proceeding that the CPS press release on the Monahan sentencing referenced specifically. Nixon received 15 years in 2021 for conspiracy to supply Class A substances and possessing prohibited firearms and ammunition. He was, in the structure Monahan had built, the figure who sat between the top and the operational layer. Not the boss, not the courier, the trusted lieutenant, the man who knew enough to function autonomously when Monahan was unavailable, who could make decisions, move product, and manage the firearms that the network maintained access to. The role is not a simple one to fill, and the sentence it attracted reflected the seriousness with which the court assessed it. Step back from the individual cases and look at what the full 40 years of the Newcastle and Tyneside organised crime record in this video actually documents. Viv Graham built a door empire across Newcastle's pubs and clubs in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, controlled who sold what on whose premises, kept drug supply networks he disagreed with away from his doors, and was shot 3 times on Wallsend High Street on New Year's Eve, 1993, by a gunman who has never been identified. The murder remains open. Paddy Conroy fought the Harrison family across the West End of Newcastle in a feud that produced 22 people shot, a man stabbed with a samurai sword, homes petrol-bombed, and eventually a torture trial in 1995 in which Billy Collier had his nostrils and front teeth removed with a pair of pliers. Conroy received 14 years, escaped from a prison taxi, became Britain's most wanted, and was returned from Spain. John Henry Sayers accumulated acquittals for conspiracy to murder and jury nobbling across 2 decades, was finally convicted of perverting the course of justice at the Old Bailey in 2018, and received 3 years and 6 months. The Benwell network supplied 6,500 customers from addresses in the West End and stored 90 knives, 6 axes and crossbows in a single domestic property. Michael Ferry directed a 53-kilogram cocaine supply chain from a cell in HMP Northumberland using an encrypted handset and received 22 years and 6 months. Shaun Monahan ran 200 kilograms of amphetamine, 51 kilograms of cocaine and 19 kilograms of heroin through vans disguised as AA and British gas vehicles during the first COVID lockdown, stored a hand grenade in a Newcastle home, fled to Turkey and received 27 years. Kevin Taylor arranged the importation of 172 kilograms of cocaine inside gas canisters driven the length of England from Kent to Tyneside and received 27 years. Robert Taylor was sentenced in his absence and found in a townhouse in Medellin. Andrew Doran was extradited from Spain in October 2025 and admitted his role in the gas canister conspiracy in December 2025. The Gateshead operations of Nathan Graham, Oliver Howlett and Tony David Ross were running between all of those eras, supplying the same streets at the street level, while the EncroChat tier organised itself above them in real time. Drug deaths in Felling in 2017 and 2018 triggered Operation Salvatore. Operation Salvatore produced 30 combined years and the arrest of 60 people in a single day. The supply continued through different networks. It always has. There is a specific detail in the Monahan case that functions as a compression of what the full Newcastle record shows. His gang stored a hand grenade in the home of a family member, not in a warehouse, not in a commercial unit, in a family home in Newcastle on a residential street during the first national COVID lockdown, while the city was under movement restrictions and the vans with British Gas logos were moving product from one side of the country to the other. The hand grenade is a physical object. It sat in a house. It was recovered by officers executing a search warrant in April 2020. Between the grenade in the Newcastle house and the gunshot wounds on Wallsend High Street in 1993, there is 30 years of the same city, the same streets, and a succession of men who believed that the position they occupied was permanent. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.